Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Maryam Golnaraghi. I am the Director of Climate Change and Emerging Environmental Topics at the Geneva Association. Welcome to the Geneva Association's second Risk Conversation event dedicated to the topic of building resilience to floods in a changing climate with focus on mature economies. I'm joined here by my two dear colleagues and co-authors, Swenja Surminski. She's the head of climate adaptation research at Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics, and Carolyn Kousky, executive director of the Wharton Risk Center at University of Pennsylvania. The agenda of the webinar today includes short statements by all of us about our key findings, followed by a panelist roundtable. We will then move to questions from the audience and participants, and we'll wrap up with some closing remarks. Just a few housekeeping points. We have over 315 participants registered for this event. So thank you very much, and we hope that you will enjoy this discussion. All participants are muted by default, but you can submit your questions in writing with the question tool that's provided in this webinar tool. Bear in mind that this webinar is being recorded, so you can have access to the recording, which will be available through YouTube as well as the GA website. The conversation today is based on a series of reports which the Geneva Association has recently published. These include 3 in-depth analyses of flood risk management in the United States, England, and Germany, and an overview report that summarizes our key findings, trends, and challenges, and offers actionable recommendations for governments, the insurance industry, businesses, households, as well as any institution that plays a role in educating the public and officials and the business world. These are downloadable at the GA website. We're also nearly done with conducting the flood risk management assessment in Canada and Australia, which will be published in early fall. Now, as you all know, floods are one of the costliest physical climate risks in many countries around the world, affecting people, communities, businesses, governments on a regular basis. The cost associated with flood risk is on the rise, owing to the increasing concentration of people and assets in high-risk zone. This is linked to land use decisions, urbanization, and development practices. Also, these costs are rising related to frequency and severity of precipitation events, as well as sea level rise linked to climate change. What we've done in this study is we have offered a comprehensive framework for any country that wishes to analyze its flood risk assessment, and we have applied it to 3 case studies. This approach is available in form of an extensive questionnaire in the reports that we've provided, and is available to anyone that would like to look at flood risk management in their respective countries. What we've paid special attention to is the evolution of governance, priorities, and institutional frameworks. And we have looked at assessment of impacts and interplay of different components of the flood risk management systems. We have looked at practices with risk assessment, risk communication, risk awareness. We've looked at early warning and emergency preparedness, activities for reducing and preventive risks, risk financing, risk transfer, and efforts for reconstruction. In addition, we've looked at 5 critical questions. Specifically, we've looked at, are there systematic efforts to monitor and assess the impact of these efforts to provide ongoing feedback to improve flood risk management in the respective country? Are there efforts to incentivize risk-based decisions? What multi-stakeholder coordination platforms exist to leverage resources and expertise across public and private sectors? Are there educational, specialized, and technical training programs and campaigns taking place in the country? And finally, and very importantly, is climate change considerations actively integrated in planning, budgeting, and activities of flood risk management system? And whether flood risk management system development and implementation is an integral part of the country's climate adaptation strategy. Well, I don't have time to go over all of our findings. I want to highlight a few points before I hand over to my colleagues Swenja and Caroline. First of all, around flood risk, there is a rising economic impact associated with floods. And what we are seeing is that in all three countries, discussion around the need to manage floods is becoming a national concern. And particularly this is in the aftermath of the flood events. All three countries experience fluvial floods, which are river floods, coastal floods. And what we see is increasingly more, there is rise in pluvial flooding, which is surface water flooding, and flash floods, particularly deeply linked to the development and urbanization. However, each kind of these flooding differs in terms of occurrence, potential damage, and management measures. What was quite noticeable, particularly in some countries and jurisdictions, is that the underpinning causes of rising flood risk directly links to the behavior at the local level. For example, with respect to local governments giving out building permits and development permits in high-risk zone, particularly for two reasons, either because of lack of flood risk information or because the revenue of local governments are deeply linked for the property taxes that they're collecting. So there's a pervasive incentive there. Now, on the other hand, if there is a damage to public assets and infrastructure, these are being paid out by the Post-Disaster Aid Fund, by the federal agencies. Now, very quickly, I want to highlight a few points of our findings. There is a growing evidence that approaches to flood risk management are slowly evolving from efforts to control waters to building resilience. However, protection of most vulnerable citizens remains the biggest challenge. Flood risk management in the three countries differs significantly because of the governance, overall strategy, political and institutional legacies, and the extent and nature of engagement of public and private sector and availability of risk information are some of the reasons behind that. While there has been increasing amount of publicly available risk information, we do see increasing risk awareness, however, with different levels of impact on decisions to reduce or prevent risk by people, businesses, and governments. Risk reduction and prevention matter. The need for ex-ante investments in risk reduction and risk prevention is gaining momentum in all the countries. However, when it comes to implementation, there are different priorities, approaches, level of coordination, and in some cases, prohibitively high cost. Countries still remain reactive to floods in the sense of doing risk financing, and in general, there is no pre-disaster budget or contingency planning process with funds appropriated by the government after the event. With respect to risk transfer and role of insurance, we see that value proposition of insurance industry is clearly evident. The industry is doing a lot. However, what we also see that sustainability and affordability of insurance remains deeply reliant on ex-ante efforts by the government to reduce and prevent risk. There is limited take-up of insurance that's linked to either low levels of flood risk awareness or understanding of the benefits of insurance, and very importantly, reliance on other support mechanisms such as the post-disaster aid by the government. Collaboration between government insurance industry has boosted accessibility and affordability of insurance program. As far as reconstruction is concerned, we are seeing that the need for building that back better is recognized. yet meaningful actions are still lacking. Climate change considerations are not systematically factored in. And a major shortcoming in all countries is that there is a lack of systematic monitoring of the impact of all the various efforts that are being undertaken by government and the private sector to look at how these making impact on the ground. Now, in conclusion, we've concluded that despite many activities, the flood risk management system remains somewhat reactive and with different levels of fragmentation. And we have stressed the need for a paradigm shift to a risk-informed, forward-looking, multi-stakeholder approach to managing flood risk. This cannot be stressed more. And what this really entails is a change in behavior, not only for those tasked with managing the risk, but also those that are at risk or creating the risk. So with that background, I'd like to go to Swenja. Swenja, you led the study in England. And in England, there is a clear evidence that flood risk management has shifted from hazard management to focusing on flood control measures, with the understanding that you cannot take all the risk out of the system. Can you give us some of the key findings and trends and challenges that you see in England? Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Maryam. And yeah, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Thanks for having me. And before I go into England, can I just say many thanks, Maryam, and congratulations to the Geneva Association for this project, because I think it sort of demonstrates vision and leadership, and most importantly, sort of a clear recognition that disasters and climate risk, including flooding, can only be managed if we think ahead and address the causes and consequences, and also recognize that, you know, flood risk management should not be a tick box exercise, but that it requires a proper and well implemented strategy. So, you know, I'm actually really grateful that we've been able to develop this framework together, which we have applied to different countries, because I think this is actually where the core value of this whole exercise is, that there is a framework that we have applied to a set of countries, but that framework can also be applied by a variety of end users to understand, you know, what's going on. Where are we? Are we sort of shifting towards a better understanding of future risk? Are we still sort of dealing with this as an engineering issue? Are we engaging other stakeholders? So it forces us all, I think, to think through this issue in a more systematic way. And I guess that's really the starting point for, you know, where we need to go with flood risk management. So again, many thanks. And yeah, I would encourage all of you to take a look and also use this framework, because I think, you know, that's sort of where the value is. We want this to become sort of a tool for better risk governance. So yeah, I mean, we've focused one of the case studies on England, and well, it's an island. Floods are not uncommon. In fact, you know, we also had earlier this year significant amounts of flooding through storms Ciara and Dennis. And, you know, there's coastal flooding, there's pluvial flooding, there's river flooding. So it's a very much a sort of present issue, and it's been identified actually also as the biggest challenge going forward in terms of climate risk. So, you know, it is certainly an issue of national concern, I would say that. And then when you look at the report, what we're doing is we're trying to give a snapshot or a stock take of, you know, where England is in terms of, you know, how it's been developing in terms of flood risk management response. And I think what you will find and what we see there is England has a very sophisticated and sort of well-established system that incorporates data, risk information, early warning, communication, and also insurance. I mean, it's one of the countries with actually highest insurance penetrations for flooding. And it has also sort of a really well-established set of policies and regulations. In fact, there is one table in the report that gives that tries to present all the different types of rules and regulations that exist, and it is quite mind-blowing to look at that, just to sort of see what exists. So, you know, I think the country has come a long way there. The fact that we are starting to actually see more and more people also talking about flood resilience is an illustration that we are sort of seeing this as not just a question of can we win the fight against floods, but recognizing that flooding, you know, it's an issue that is already bad, but it's most likely to get even worse with climate change. And I think this is, again, this is a trend that we've seen happening. So there's certainly on paper, when you look at it, you know, a really sort of a move towards an integrated, more systematic approach. I guess the key question is then, you know, how does the reality look like and how well is this system performing? And, you know, I think there we've identified also a couple of sort of maybe lessons or interesting observations. And I think maybe to start with, a clear strength is on the knowledge and information side. I mean, in England, there are various sets of risk information, risk communication channels through the Environment Agency and so on. And, you know, it is by and large also publicly available and accessible. What is far less clear is the application of that. And is that data actually being used? And is it being used in these important decisions about, you know, where to build, how to build, you know, whether or not to have insurance or whether to grant a mortgage? That's a really key observation. We've been investigating this for the mortgage sector, for the financial sector, and we noticed that in that particular industry, it is really very, very early days for companies to start looking at flood risk data when they make their mortgage decisions. And it's quite interesting to see, I think insurers, you know, obviously they have a history of working with models and tools, but I think what needs to happen is also more sort of cross-sectoral collaboration there between insurers and other industries. So, and the other interesting observation, I guess, picks up on this question of, you know, have we learned lessons? I mean, I've been working in this space for, well, far too long, and I've been responding and participating in lots of inquiries, lessons learned. We've had a revision of legislation. We have a Water Management Act. And, you know, there have been a lot of efforts in terms of reviewing and identifying issues and channels. I guess, surprise, surprise, the key question is, are these recommendations then being implemented? And do we have a good way of monitoring actually how well we as a country here are doing and how well these risks are managed? And I think this is another key gap. I mean, if you wanted to check how resilient the country is, how well certain things are working, you know, you wouldn't really know where to go and how to assess that. And I think this is, again, this is something that we just need to you know, develop and strengthen, because otherwise, you know, we're wasting basically the opportunity to learn from issues. And then maybe two other final points. So, you know, in this whole framework, we always argue that flat risk management needs to be seen as, you know, something where different parties work together, and it's not really a question of, you know, here's risk ownership. It's either the government or the insurer or the bank or the homeowner. I think we recognize that, you know, the issue is big, the issue is complex, and it will only actually really work if we can bring these different players together. And in England, there are platforms, you know, there have been efforts. Insurers have also been doing this for quite some time, engaging with government. But I would say, you know, it is still fairly limited, and there are large segments of society, particularly other sort of industry sectors, who are not really part of these efforts. And I think that's also hampering innovation. So again, that's an observation there. And then just very finally, you know, we see more and more people talking about resilience as a sort of concept and recognizing that there is no silver bullet. So it's not a question of just building walls or, you know, investing in flood defenses. You have to think broader. But, you know, that can also become quite a sort of, you know, easy way to hide and say, oh yeah, we're doing lots of things and nobody really knows how this is progressing. So again, this is something where often at a local level you see most progress. I mean, we've mentioned in the report some work we're doing with a local government in the East Coast with a city there, Lowestoft is the city. And, you know, they're heavily exposed, but they're also turning this into almost an opportunity. They know any future strategy needs to be built on flood resilience. And they are thinking this through in terms of ecosystem services and a wide range of efforts. So I think that's encouraging. And yeah, I think there are, you know, these are just kind of a couple of points from the report. So I'm very happy to pick up some of those in the discussion.
Excellent, thank you so much. So Caroline, let's go to you now. What we found in the United States, it's that flood risk management is a shared responsibility across many federal agencies, all levels of government, private sector, non-governmental agency. There seems to be a lot of complementarities, but also there seems to be a lot of redundancy and also many gaps remain. So maybe you can highlight some of the findings from the United States for the discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And let me echo Swenja first in thanking Maryam and the Geneva Association. It's just been fantastic to be a part of this collaboration and be able to make these kind of comparisons across different countries and how they're handling their flood risk. So as Maryam started, you know, flooding is the most costly natural disaster in the US. It includes many types of flooding, from storm surge and coastal tidal floods to riverine, increases in rainfall flooding. And the approach to flood risk management in the US has really shifted over the decades, from maybe more of a focus many decades ago on great infrastructure and built solutions to flooding to a much broader perspective on building flood resilience for households and communities and for the country. And as you noted, the full range of flood risk management activities, if you include sort of education and outreach and pre-disaster mitigation through emergency response and post-disaster long-term recovery, you know, that's a vast set of roles and responsibilities, and those are shared across different federal agencies in the US and also different scales of government, and then also, of course, with the private sector and NGOs. And similarly, in the US, we have multiple entities that are collecting and sharing flood risk data, both public sector entities doing this and private sector and nonprofits, as well as academics. So there's a vast amount of information available on flood risk and how it's changing, which is really fantastic, but maybe similar to England, sometimes navigating all of that can be confusing for certain users, and we probably still have a challenge in making the information we have and the data we have relevant to the decisions being made, actionable, and easy to access and understand at the point that it's needed. Shifting now to the flood insurance program, the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, has become really the dominant non-structural approach to flood risk management in the United States. It was founded over 5 decades ago. Communities voluntarily opt into the program, and when they do that, they have to adopt minimum floodplain management regulations governing their 1% chance floodplain. And once they adopt those, which essentially require that all new construction be at or above the base flood elevation, then their residents become eligible to purchase flood insurance through the program. Of course, those of you following US Flood know that the National Flood Insurance Program faces a number of challenges right now, particularly related to its fiscal condition. It's been billions of dollars in debt to the US Treasury since the losses from 2005. And part of this is that there remains sort of political and social disagreement on how much of the cost of floods should be borne by residents through higher premiums that fully reflect the sort of complete risk of flooding, and how much should be sort of more broadly socialized across taxpayers, and how to do that. To implement the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA has been mapping flood hazards in the country on what are called FIRMS, flood insurance rate maps. And as the name suggests, they were originally designed to help with the pricing of flood insurance, with the rating of flood insurance. FEMA is now exploring a new approach to rating that will not rely on these maps, and is going to be rolling that out in 2021. The maps are, though, also needed for 2 regulatory purposes. So, and that's defining that 1% chance floodplain, which in the US is referred to as the special flood hazard area. And within that area, we have a federal requirement that if you have a loan from you have a federally backed loan or a loan from a federally regulated lender, you're required to purchase flood insurance for the life of your loan. And that zone, that special flood hazard area, is also where the local governments have to adopt these minimum floodplain management regulations. So these maps are important for these regulatory requirements. But sort of in the absence over the decades of alternatives to flood hazard information, they've become, which is now changing obviously, but they've become sort of the de facto risk communication tools for households, for communities, and in that role, they fall short on a number of dimensions. So for example, right, they suggest that flood risk is binary by just having a sort of, you know, the conversation around flooding in the US is often in or out. Are you in this zone or are you out of this zone? But we know flood risk, of course, is not binary, right? They fail to indicate anything about the potential impacts from flooding. They're focused all on, you know, mapping probability in these zones. And they don't take a forward-looking view of risk, which makes sense when they were designed for annual pricing of insurance, because in your annual insurance, you can't charge for what the risk is going to be, you know, 3 decades from now. But if you're a local government making decisions on where to develop or where to site things, or you're a household choosing where to live and you plan to stay there for a while, you do need information on how that risk is changing, and you can't get that through the FEMA maps. And as has been mentioned, you know, we know that flood risk is increasing in most communities in the US. This is, you know, climate change, so sea level rise and changing storm patterns on the coast. This is increasing intense rainfall events in many places around the country. We also continue to build in risky locations. And in the US, much of our gray infrastructure, our levees and dams, are aging and it really in serious need of maintenance and upgrading. And failure to invest in that infrastructure is just exacerbating the risk of that infrastructure failing. Which we've seen recently in the US. As that risk of flooding is growing from all these combined factors, we're also going to need to take a look at response, right? Contrary to a lot of popular misconception in the US, federal aid after a big flood is insufficient when it comes for households to rebuild, and often really delayed. Most post-flood federal dollars go to long-term recovery and mitigation. So indeed, over 90% of flood mitigation dollars from the federal government are appropriated off budget and tied to these big disaster supplementals that we pass after major disaster events. There's small steps that this is starting to change and that there's going to be more dollars available sort of pre-disaster. So one example that came out of some 2018 legislation is FEMA's new BRIC program, which stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. So I think we're at the beginning of sort of a shift in how we think about funding and prioritizing flood mitigation. And I think my last point is just that as we have this conversation about how to reform disaster finance, we need to pay particular attention to lower income households. These families can be really devastated by flood events. They can't afford the cost of flood insurance ahead of time. And despite bipartisan support for the idea of a means-tested assistance program to help lower income families afford flood insurance, Congress has yet to adopt any program like this. These families don't have enough in savings to rebuild from a devastating flood on their own. As we said, federal disaster aid is insufficient for them. And often when they get aid, say maybe through the HUD programs, it comes too late, right? In the sort of immediate weeks and months, there's this big financing gap. And work by a colleague has also found that these households are locked out of access to credit. So they can be denied the federal disaster loans, for example, for not meeting debt to income and credit score requirements. So for all these reasons, we really need to focus more policy attention on helping our most vulnerable recover from flood events. So I think that's kind of a broad overview. I think we can say that the US has come a long way in our management of floods, and you can see this sort of nice progression. We've made a lot of progress, but there's clearly still work to do, particularly in face of the escalating risks.
Thank you so much. And one interesting thing about insurance coverage is the difference we saw with England, you know, a very high penetration versus Germany being somewhat increasing, whereas in the US, it's very low and very much geographically focused. In some places, maybe as low as 2%, 1%, or none at all. So we will get into that. Swenja, can you just make a couple of comments? What I found about Germany, which is another case that you've led, is the federated political system. And what I found striking in Germany is that most federal states have no or very little legal obligation to compensate damages to homeowners and businesses. Taking off the last point that Carolyn has made in the United States, in Germany, there is no legal obligation for government to actually cover these costs. So can you maybe give us a couple of points about Germany, and then we would like to move to more discussion session?
Yes, thanks, Maryam. So yes, you are right. I mean, when you look at the legal situation, it is quite clear that ultimately the responsibility sits with the individual. You know, there are certain exceptions, and of course also local authorities and the government has a certain duty, and you know, there's sort of a duty of care element, of course, there in terms of also liability issues. But by and large, the system, you know, is sort of geared towards this notion of, you know, responsibility at an individual level. Although, having said that, you know, that was not always the case in terms of policies and expectation, I guess, because as you say, insurance uptake was relatively low. It's now increasing, and there have been actually some shifts there, with government also changing their approach to post-disaster support, and trying also to sort of incentivize the uptake of insurance. So I think that's an interesting development. But maybe just to kind of remind all of us, so Germany is exposed also to various types of flooding. So you have coastal, fluvial and pluvial flooding. In particular, in recent years, this issue of urban sort of surface water and flash floods are an area of growing concerns. And to some extent, that has been a little bit of surprise, well, not necessarily surprising, but it has been sort of a new dimension, because I guess if you're on the coast or if you're on one of the major rivers that run through Germany, then again, flooding is not really something unheard of. And it's, so my hometown, Hamburg, for example, I mean, flood risk management is really, you know, important, because we've suffered from significant floods there. With dramatic consequences. So I think you can see a clear distinction between that and then this sort of urban flash flood type, which seems to surprise a lot of communities. And this is also then a question of, you know, where's the responsibility for that and how is that being managed? Because in our research and our discussions with stakeholders there, it became quite clear that you have, again, a myriad of agencies, institutions working on this, but particularly when it comes to surface water flooding, so, you know, the induced by heavy rainfall, you know, the sort of system is still fairly, you know, disconnected, I would say. And it is basically down to individual cities and often local communities to then sort of embrace this, but they often, you know, are facing issues around, you know, sharing data and risk information. And I just want to highlight a particular case where we're actually working with the city of Cologne, which has, you know, history of flooding along the River Rhine, but away from those more traditional flood zones, there's now sort of the challenge of urban flash floods. And, you know, they are actually one of the first communities in Germany who've made these surface water flood risk maps publicly available, which, you know, raises also quite a few sort of legal issues and concerns about data protection and how that would be interpreted. And they kind of decided, or the city officials decided, to also use it as an engagement tool. And they set some platforms to engage with different parts of their community. And, you know, it's quite interesting to see now other cities sort of replicating that. And I think this is an interesting sort of trend and development, because, you know, of course, it's a federal system. There's a lot of responsibility all the way down to the local level. But I think there's a lot of sort of learning from each other. And I think also neighboring communities are starting to connect on this. I think one of the other key points was, I would say, in Germany is, you know, again, there is a lot of risk information out there. Insurers actually have been quite heavily involved in developing tools and databases. There's this SURS flood hazard zoning system, but is this being used, and is this being accessible, and is this also being then applied in the context of land use decisions, in terms of informing local populations. And I think, you know, there's really, well, let's call it room for you know, further efforts in this space. And I guess coming back to your initial question about individual responsibility, there's a really interesting new initiative. It's called the Flood Passport, or the Hochwasserpass in German, which kind of is tied to a building and tracks also information about property level mitigation efforts that homeowners or those who live in the properties can kind of then share, also in an insurance context, but also with local authorities. And I think this is quite an interesting example, because it sort of looks also into the future, like, okay, we are exposed today, but we know it's not likely going to be resolved. So we need to sort of incorporate this within a building structure. So yeah, I think there are some interesting ideas to follow up.
Thank you for that. And I would like to encourage our participants to please submit your questions. We're going to continue with our question and answer. And as I see more questions coming, we will entertain participants' questions. I'm going to pose some questions, and I would love if each of you can give some very quick feedback using examples from the countries that you've led. First of all, you know, one of the recommendations that we've made for any mature economy that wants to build flood resilience is around taking a risk-informed, forward-looking approach to this, and particularly we've highlighted climate change. In your opinions, very quickly, is it feasible, given the current complex nature of flood risk management, to meaningfully incorporate climate change considerations in the FRM system in each of these respected countries? And, you know, what does that mean for planning, coordination, collaboration? If I can maybe have Caroline reflect about what are you seeing in the United States and where do you think it should be going?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and it's clearly really critical, but there are a few challenges. First, the climate impacts, I think, are really important for decisions about siting, development, and for households determining where to live, right? And most of those decisions in the US are influenced most by state and local policy. And there we see just wide variation. So we have some cities like New York City that's been making real strides in incorporating climate into their decision-making about development and building codes, about making climate projections available to their residents, and other local jurisdictions have done very little or almost nothing. And that can be for a number of reasons, right? Some don't have the resources to do so, some it's just not a priority given all the other competing demands, and unfortunately there's still also some places in the US where climate is not taken as a serious threat that merits public response. The federal government does have some tools to help incorporate kind of changing flood risk into decision making. One way to do this would be that federal funding can be conditioned on projects being built to standards that take into account changing risk, well, from climate or any other source, right? The Obama administration had tried to do this after Hurricane Sandy with the flood risk management standard. Trump rescinded that, but efforts in that vein are continuing. I also just want to end with one other, challenge, which is that we have really good sea level rise information available, some other impacts, but when it comes to thinking about changing intense precipitation events, which you can really see in the data, it's more difficult to get those impacts at a spatial scale that's most helpful for planning. Pluvial stormwater flooding varies a lot based on very local conditions like culverts or whether the storm drain has been cleared of debris and so forth. And so national models can miss some of that important sort of local drivers of that risk. But there's actually some really interesting approaches to solving this through sort of new data and technology. Like we have some communities that have apps where people enter when they see things like street flooding or basement flooding, and then from that citizen created data, you can make heat maps of where sort of the biggest risks are. So that type of approach is starting to emerge.
Excellent, thank you. Swenja, maybe a minute response to this, and maybe you can look at Germany and England maybe in a comparative way.
Yes, I mean, if I have to compare it, and with a bit of a health warning, I guess the study is not really all about just comparing them side by side. It's kind of picking up on different aspects, right, because they are very different. So just as an aside. So, but I think by and large, I would feel that climate change is more closely integrated into flood risk management in England, maybe institutionally. I mean, definitely the Environment Agency, but also DEFRA. They are both also in charge for climate adaptation. So I think, there is institutionally a greater link. And we've actually also have requirements that you need to consider future flood risk when you make land use decisions or planning decisions. I guess the question is, the data is there, we have scenarios, but is it being used? And is somebody actually monitoring this? And that's kind of the big weakness there. I think the other aspect on this is more and more companies in the financial sector are now also going into climate disclosure. And, flood risk, particularly in the financial sector here in the UK, but also in Germany, is a fair chunk in this. And I think there is a disconnect in terms of, you conduct your climate scenario assessments, you try and understand where your assets are, but you do not really have any information about how effective are these risks being managed on the ground. And can I rely on flood risk management doing its job? Can I rely on properties being protected or being built more resilient? I think there's a big disconnect there. And I think this is another area that really needs to be addressed because, you can't really make decisions without understanding whether we are making the right decisions to manage risk or whether we just continue creating new risks.
Thank you so much. One of the biggest things that we studied in this series of reports was around risk awareness. And, publicly available information is definitely leading to more risk awareness among households, businesses, and various levels of the government. But the question is risk awareness enough? And do we need more incentives to shift the society into a risk-informed decision-making culture? So maybe I can start with you, Swenja. In Germany, you mentioned about the passport program. Can you tell us a little bit how it works, particularly going to what you said, incentivizing the households in starting to actually implement retrofit measures to reduce the flood risk of their own homes? It's costly. How can we incentivize people?
Yes, I mean, this is quite an interesting question because you could argue, is it a risk? Is it like a carrot that you kind of dangle, or is it a stick that you push someone in doing it? And I think that the approach is very much on the carrot side, that you try and say, look, there are benefits, particularly if you have been flooded and if you have already been exposed, it's likely it's going to happen again. Here is a tool that allows you to also demonstrate what's happening in your building. You can use it in your discussions with insurers. Insurers are recognizing that, but you can also share that with your local authorities. You can then sort of say, look, there are certain weaknesses in the system. I need support for that. So I think, it's early days, and I don't actually know how well it is working, but it's an interesting concept. I think in the UK, we actually had something a little bit along those lines, which was like a traffic light system. If you wanted to sell your house, that you would have to give information about flooding, that and a sort of disclosure at that level, which again comes a little bit more on the stick side. You have to share that information. That was sort of taken off. I guess there might be a chance to reintroduce it, but always keep in mind, incentives are good. Sometimes I think you have to nudge maybe through a bit of regulation as well.
And what about you, Caroline? What about United States in terms of risk awareness versus incentives to actually do work? I want to particularly focus on the post-disaster aid program in United States. And what impacts does it have in terms of people actually taking action to protect themselves, to buy insurance, to that, as well as local governments? Can you tell us how that incentivizing or disincentivizing, and what do we need to do to change that?
Yeah, sure. There's some programs in the US, and we could certainly be doing more when it comes to incentives and also grant programs. So there's federal grant programs after presidentially declared disasters that can make grants available for states and local governments to adopt flood mitigation measures, whether that's sort of community level infrastructure investments, buyouts, elevation, these types of things. And as I said, we're starting to see a little bit more in terms of federal grant for mitigation, even pre-disaster. There already was one standing program within FEMA for this, and now there's going to be more. And I think, you know, there's clearly further steps that can be taken in terms of helping better align the financial incentives to do more risk reduction. I wanted to highlight one area that I think doesn't get attention, but actually is important when it comes to thinking about getting households to make these behavior changes. And that is, while we certainly need to do a better job with risk communication and all this financing, I think it's also important to think about programs that support the entire implementation process, because we've seen, for example, that some households will learn they're at risk and then they need to know what to do. But once they even have that, like, I should move my mechanicals, or I should change to flood resistant flooring, or even elevate my home. And then the next step is where we often stop providing support. So, but who do they call? How do they know it's someone they can trust? How do they know what a fair price is? And that whole process of just figuring out how to get it done can be so time consuming and confusing that households might just stop. And so I think we need to think more about comprehensive programs that take information to actual implementation.
Okay, we lost you a little bit over there. Let's connect to another issue, which is, let me just see, I think I have some questions also are sort of, another thing, let me just see, let's talk about intersectoral collaboration. One thing that we've seen is that increasingly in all these countries, intersectoral collaboration is rising, particularly between public and private sector. And one area where we see significant benefits is when insurance industry and government actually work together, align their priorities, and leverage their expertise in all these relevant areas that goes far beyond just providing insurance. Can you share a little bit from where you've seen those benefits, particularly, Swenja, I want to go back to, for example, the flood program or the various things that has happened in Germany that has come out of that collaboration.
Yes, I think it is, as I said earlier, it is really important to see this as an issue that requires different players to act together. And I think, again, on paper, in both countries, we've seen, particularly with insurance industry and government, interactions and collaborations and some initiatives. I mean, in the UK, we have Flood as a result. And, you know, there have been information sharing exercises. And, you know, I think there's a long established relationship between government and industry. And in Germany, also around this data sharing information platform. I think on paper that is good. I think the reality in both countries is more challenging, because in both countries we have, you know, this is a private market that obviously insurers are operating in. And, you know, there's a sort of constant question of, you know, how you bring that together, that sort of public risk reduction resilience view with, you know, your role as a player in a competitive market. And I think from my observations in both countries, I would say what hasn't really sunk in within the industry is really this understanding. What this is all about is securing, you know, future insurability and kind of amending business models so that it is no longer just about offering an insurance policy, but actually making your risk knowledge and advice almost like a service that is part of the package. And, you know, that might sound all very abstract, but there are examples where insurers are trying to work with customers, often with business customers, to sort of manage risk together. That is not happening on the residential side. And, you know, there are challenges and reasons for that. But I think that's where I would hope that also, you know, innovation in terms of new service offerings from the industry are important, because otherwise, that sort of market segment, I mean, if the climate scenarios and trends that we are seeing will continue and we don't manage the risk, then insurance is not really going to be part of our response for the longer term.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at a lot of the questions that's coming from the participants, and I just want to point to the participants that each of the reports contain massive amount of details that you can refer to. So I would like to urge you to really go to these 4 reports, which are accessible through the GA website. And our point was to really dig deep so that we can help facilitate discussions. But one of the things that I see repeatedly in the questions is role of engineers and technical community. I think, Swenja, you did talk about the need for more collaborations across various sectors and inclusion of the financial sectors, the mortgage and lending industry. I think one of the questions is how the technical and engineering world comes into this. And I think that goes to maybe the system-wide nature of this issue. To that point, can you elaborate a little bit when particularly we go into building codes, development of the building codes, upgrading of this, how the technical world gets engaged in each country? That's the first one. And the second questions that I see, there are questions related to, why shouldn't we take a more of a multi-hazard approach to this? Shouldn't the countries move to thinking not just about one risk, but holistically about all these risks? And what does that mean in terms of complication and implementation? So if each of you can give a couple of minutes of feedback on that question.
Okay, well, on the first point with technology and engineering, I mean, there are significant innovations in terms of how we build, what materials we can use. I mean, this dates back, this is not a new thing. I mean, we've had sort of innovative building construction approaches, also in terms of flood defenses, new sort of innovative strategies. They exist. The question is, do we kind of trust them? Have they been tested? Is there enough exchange with those communities that have been developing that? And I guess sometimes people, at least that's kind of result from our work, sometimes people, feel more relying on, the sort of visible hard defenses and, that kind of phenomenon. If you see a big flood wall, you feel safer. If it is more of a system-wide approach, you don't see it, and so you don't trust it. I think this is an area that needs further collaboration and further, maybe also openness and transparency, because this has been pointed out also by insurers, that they often say, well, we don't really know how well these other measures, like also nature-based solutions, more sort of softer approaches to managing risk, how well do they work? And can we test that? Can we understand that better? And I think we just know that if we want to address these risks, and if we also want to do this in a sustainable way, then often, the sort of concrete wall example is certainly not where a lot of communities want to go. So I think that would be on that point, that would be my response.
And Caroline, over to you. US is a complex country, a complex FRM system. We have the Army Corps of Engineers. How does the technical side get actually incorporated?
Yeah, a lot, the technical side comes in both in building codes at a state and local level and construction of structural protection, which at a federal level is managed, as you said, by the Corps of Engineers. I think an area where we're starting to see a lot more work, and more work still needs to be done, is on approaches, nature-based solutions for flood protection and sort of design standards around those, and how to kind of take our traditional approach to building community level flood protection and apply it to these more green approaches. I also wanted to say a word about this sort of original question about partnerships with the insurance sector, because as you know, in the US, the National Flood Insurance Program has been the predominant provider of residential flood for 5 decades. But we're recently seeing the emergence of a private sector market for residential flood. And I think this is sort of an exciting opportunity because the NFIP is really a one-size-fits-all policy, but we know, as we talked about at the beginning, that types of flood risk vary enormously within the US and in these other countries, and also, sort of the needs and financial conditions of households vary. And so I think one opportunity is that the private sector can start better tailoring products to needs. So for example, we've seen some homeowners policies now having the option where you could add on a flood protection to your homeowner policy, and it has a low coverage limit, and it's designed for areas really of pluvial flood risk, where you might get a few inches of water in your house, but not where you're going to be knocked over by storm surge, right? But that can provide really important financial protection, and then can also be linked to mitigation options that the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't incentivize. So things like changing your flooring, moving your mechanicals, changing the grading around your home, installing sump pumps, drainage. These are lower cost options that can reduce risk that the private sector might be able to offer incentives for.
Thank you so much. So I'm looking at the list of questions that are being posed by the participants. And one thing I want to point to the participants that to all the questions that you have raised, the reports provide quite a lot of detailed information that you can say. For example, people are asking about flood-re. Flood-re is being used, globally as an example of where government and insurance industry can work together to address issues of affordability and accessibility. We've done quite an in-depth review of flood-re, its strengths, weaknesses, and challenges. So I would urge to read the England report for that. There are questions related, for example, on how risk communication and is working in the 3 countries. That is again detailed out in the report. So if these are the topics you're interested, I want to personally urge you to get hold of these reports. What we've done is we've developed these reports to create a foundation for positive engagement and discussion, not only in these countries, but in any mature economy that would like to strengthen and build its flood resilience. So that's why we've gone deep into all aspects, from policy, legal, institutional, to really the details of each of the programs, that each of the type of activities. So again, I urge you to review. We only have 3 minutes to close, so I want to come back to each of you for a 1-minute intervention of, it's been 2 years. We've worked on this very heavily, and obviously we have quite an extensive program ahead of us. What are the 1 or 2 things that you think in each of those countries, or in general, the world needs to focus on as we move to strengthen flood resilience? Caroline, first over to you.
Great, sure, thanks. I think we're making a lot of forward progress on building flood resilience. But of course, there's still more work that needs to be done, and we've touched on a lot of these. One of the most important maybe is that we're seeing in the US a lot of advances in non-public sector players providing risk information, communication, assisting in different ways. And I think we need to sort of better map out where the public and private sectors have a comparative advantage and kind of better define roles and responsibilities. Some of the other areas where I think public policy needs some attention, we've already talked about, adjusting building codes and land use in light of increasing flood risk, more work on pre-disaster mitigation, assisting low and moderate income families, both with risk reduction and with recovery, and making sort of usable information a key decision point. So I think those would be sort of my top priority areas.
Great, thank you. Swenja, 1 minute, over to you.
Yes, so 2 points I would mention here. The first one is we really need to see risk management and resilience as an investment and not as a cost, as a sort of thing that you can avoid, but you see it as a cost that hurts you now. And I think this is starting to sink in, but what does it mean? How can you then make this sort of an investable option? How can you give a local authority more tools to identify the benefits and the sort of multiple benefits of investing in flood risk management? It's not just reducing risk, it is also should be a contribution to making a viable community. And similar to the financial sector, who is kind of currently thinking this through in terms of, can we invest in resilience? And I'm discussing this a lot with insurers who say, well, give us some metrics, how can I come up with a resilient investment strategy? And I think this is an area that there's a lot of opportunity there. And just very lastly, because we didn't answer that comment on multi-hazard approach, I mean, I think we've all seen this happening over the last couple of months. I mean, we're not living in a single hazard world. Actually, risks are connected, complex, and require us to also think in a systematic way. So yes, I think we need to consider how what we've learned on flood risk management can also be applied and how it's been influenced by other risk management strategies.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. I wanted to just stress that Geneva Association is dedicated to doing this type of research and bring together different stakeholders around the table. We will have roundtables in each country, as well as other mature economies that would like to build their flood risk management and resilience. So this will be a year of positive, engaging discussion involving the insurance industry, the governments, and other key stakeholders. So please stay tuned. And I want to thank all the participants for joining us, and I hope you found this conversation useful. Please go to the Geneva Association website and see the reports. Thank you very much. Thank you to my co-authors and co-investigators, and wish you all a great day and a wonderful year ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.